In the spring of 1945, American intelligence officers entered a bombed-out German facility and found something that stopped them cold. Not a weapon, not a body. A photograph, a single grainy image of an aircraft so advanced it shouldn't have existed. Not yet. Not by any calculation they had made. The aircraft in that photograph had no propeller. It had no piston engine. It had swept wings, twin jet pods, and the unmistakable silhouette of something that had already left the future behind. What they were looking at was the Heinkel He-162, and the story of how it came to exist, how it was conceived, built, and flown in a matter of weeks is one of the most alarming chapters in the history of aerial warfare. To understand what the He-162 represented, you have to understand what Germany looked like in the summer of 1944. The Reich was collapsing on every front. The Normandy landings had succeeded. Soviet forces were grinding westward. Allied bombers were dismantling German industry city by city. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on Earth, was being bled white. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel was becoming critically scarce. And the aircraft that had carried Germany through the early war years were now being torn apart by a new generation of Allied fighters. There was one card left to play. Germany had pioneered jet propulsion. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was already in limited combat service. And while it was revolutionary, it was also expensive, complex, and demanded trained pilots who no longer existed in sufficient numbers. The High Command needed something different, something faster to produce, something simpler to fly, something that could be manufactured using minimal strategic materials, wood, steel, whatever remained, and could be put into the hands of Hitler Youth pilot trainees in weeks, not months. What followed was one of the most audacious aviation programs in history. A jet fighter, designed, built, and flown to operational standard in under 90 days. The Germans called it the Volksjäger, the People's Fighter. The Allies would come to know it as the He-162 Salamander. And when they finally understood what they were dealing with, several of them admitted, quietly, that if it had arrived 6 months earlier, the air war over Europe might have looked very different. The formal request came on September 8, 1944. The Reich Air Ministry issued an emergency specification calling for a single-engine jet fighter capable of reaching 750 kilometers per hour, armed with at least one 30mm cannon, and manufacturable by semi-skilled labor using non-strategic materials. The deadline for a flying prototype was January 1, 1945. That was less than 4 months away. For most nations, designing a jet aircraft from scratch takes years. Germany's aviation industry was being asked to do it in weeks. Several manufacturers submitted proposals. Focke-Wulf entered a design. Blohm und de Vos submitted one of their characteristically unconventional concepts. The contract went to Heinkel. Ernst Heinkel's company had deep roots in jet development. It was a Heinkel aircraft, the He-178. That had made the world's first jet-powered flight back in August 1939. The company understood turbine propulsion in a way few others did. And crucially, they believed they could meet the deadline. The design team at Heinkel's Vienna Schwach facility worked at a pace that was almost incomprehensible under normal circumstances. Lead engineer Siegfried Gunter, who had been responsible for some of Heinkel's most elegant pre-war designs, drove the program forward. The configuration that emerged was distinctive and, in retrospect, dangerously clever. A single BMW 003 turbojet engine, the 109 003A1, mounted above the fuselage. Directly behind the cockpit, swept-back wing leading edges. Largely wooden construction in the wings and tail to conserve aluminum. A tricycle undercarriage. Twin tail fins. The whole aircraft was compact, light, and built around the premise that simplicity was survival. The BMW 003 engine was itself a compromise. The preferred power plant for German jets was the Jumo 004, which equipped the Me 262, But that engine was already in high demand, and its production was being disrupted by Allied bombing. The WWII produced less thrust, approximately 800 kilograms of force, but it was lighter and somewhat easier to manufacture. The trade-off was performance. The He-162 would be quick, but it would not be as powerful as engineers initially hoped. At altitude, in certain configurations, the engine could be temperamental. That detail would matter. Construction of the first prototype, designated V-1, took place at a pace that alarmed even the workers building it. The wooden wing sections were assembled by furniture manufacturers and cabinet makers, craftsmen conscripted into aviation work. Following technical drawings they had never seen before. The fuselage was metal, riveted and welded by conventional aviation workers. The integration of these two manufacturing streams was never fully resolved. Small tolerances became significant ones. Adhesives used in the wooden components were not always consistent. These were not theoretical concerns. They would kill people. The prototype was ready for its first flight on December 6, 1944. The location was Henkel's Airfield at Marieni near Rostock on Germany's Baltic coast. The pilot selected for the maiden flight was Flugkapitän Goddard Peter, a Heinkel Company test pilot with significant experience in high-performance aircraft. The flight lasted approximately 20 minutes. By any objective measure, it was a success. The He-162 was fast, responsive, and handled well at altitude. Peter's assessment was cautiously positive. The aircraft flew. It flew well, and it had done so in a time frame that no Allied program had ever matched. But the second test flight, held just 4 days later, on December 10th, ended in catastrophe. During a high-speed pass over the airfield, with senior Luftwaffe officers and Nazi Party officials watching from the ground, the right-wing leading edge separated from the aircraft. The wooden structure had failed. The bonding adhesive, later identified as a formaldehyde-based compound, had not cured properly in the cold Baltic air. Goddard Peter died in the crash. He was not the last. The program did not stop. There was no time for it to stop. Post-crash analysis identified the adhesive failure as a manufacturing quality issue rather than a fundamental design flaw, and corrective measures were ordered immediately. But those corrections could only be applied going forward. Aircraft already in the production pipeline carried the same vulnerability until the change was implemented across all facilities. Germany was building a jet fighter at industrial speed with industrial era. Quality control in a country being systematically bombed. The contradictions were unsustainable. Operational testing continued through January and February of 1945. The EHR Probungskommando 162, a dedicated evaluation unit, put the aircraft through its combat paces at Lechfeld in Bavaria, one of the Luftwaffe's primary jet testing facilities. Pilots who flew the He-162 in this period recorded impressions that were remarkably consistent. The aircraft was genuinely fast. In level flight, it approached and in some configurations slightly exceeded 800 kilometers per hour, depending on altitude and load. It climbed quickly. The cockpit visibility was good. But the BMW 003 engine was sensitive. Throttle movements had to be smooth and deliberate. Sudden acceleration could cause compressor stalls. At lower altitudes, in the tight maneuvering that combat demanded, the engine could flame out without warning. And there was the structural question that never fully went away, the question of what the airframe would do under sustained stress at maximum speed. The Luftwaffe pilots assigned to the He-162 were, by this stage of the war, a strange mixture of the extremely experienced and the dangerously raw. Veteran aces who had survived 5 years of air combat flew alongside men who had barely completed their training. The concept of using Hitler Youth pilot candidates, teenagers with glider experience, was never fully abandoned at the planning level, though in practice the aircraft proved too demanding for pilots without substantial flight hours. The Volksjäger concept, the people's fighter in the most literal sense, remained an aspiration rather than a reality. Jagdgeschwader I, based at Parchim and later dispersed to emergency airstrips in northern Germany, received the first operational He-162s in early 1945 and was declared combat-ready in April. By then, the war had perhaps 3 weeks left. The unit flew intercept missions against Allied aircraft, primarily British and American bombers and their escorts operating over northern Germany and the Netherlands. The operational record from this period is fragmentary and contested. German records are incomplete. Allied claims of He-162 encounters are not always verifiable. What is documented is that a small number of aerial engagements occurred, that at least one Allied aircraft was downed by an He-162, and that the jet fighters were never deployed in numbers sufficient to alter the outcome of a single mission, let alone the war. Production numbers tell the story most starkly. Approximately 300 He-162s were completed by the end of the war. Hundreds more were in various stages of assembly. At peak production, the factories were turning out aircraft at a rate that, had the war continued, might have become genuinely significant. But the factories were being bombed. The fuel supply was collapsing. The pilots were running out. And Allied ground forces were physically overrunning the airfields from which the jets operated. In late April and early May of 1945, as German resistance disintegrated, a significant number of He-162s were captured intact at Lech Airfield in Schleswig-Holstein, where JG-1 had made its final dispersal. British forces took possession of them on May 6, 1945, 2 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. The Americans captured additional examples at other locations. Within weeks, American, British, and eventually Soviet aviation engineers were examining the aircraft with a focus that bordered on reverence. The post-war evaluation of the He-162 produced conclusions that were, depending on who was writing them, either reassuring or deeply unsettling. British test pilots who flew captured examples at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough noted the aircraft's speed and the severity of its handling characteristics, particularly the engine sensitivity and the structural unpredictability under stress. American evaluators at Wright Field reached similar conclusions. The aircraft was not, they determined, a war winner as it stood. The manufacturing defects, the engine limitations, the training requirements, these were real and significant constraints, but the margin was uncomfortably close. Had the He-162 program begun 6 months earlier? Had Germany's industrial base not been systematically destroyed? Had the adhesive formulation been correct from the start? Had fuel remained available? The historians who have studied this program most carefully tend to avoid the word almost, but they use it anyway, in quieter moments. Because the He-162, more than almost any other aircraft of the Second World War, represents a race that was genuinely lost by weeks rather than years. Ernst Heinkel survived the war. Siegfried Gunter, the lead engineer, also survived and later worked in the West German aviation industry. The BMW 003 engine, studied extensively by Allied engineers, contributed in measurable ways to the development of post-war jet propulsion on both sides of the Atlantic. Several captured He-162 airframes remain in museums today at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, at the RAF Museum in London, at the Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin. You can look at them, you can walk around them and understand, in a way that photographs do not quite convey, how small they are. How light. How simple, for something that nearly changed everything. The arms race that the He-162 was built to end was the race to put a viable jet fighter into mass production before the other side could respond. Germany crossed that finish line. They crossed it in December 1944 on a frozen airfield on the Baltic coast, and the aircraft flew, and it was fast, and 4 days later it killed its pilot, and by the time they fixed it, the war was over. That is the story of the Volksjäger. Not a failure, not a success. Something more uncomfortable than either.